This is Rick Levine with your August 2021 astrology forecast. Before we get into the month ahead, there's just a couple of very quick announcements I'd like to make. The first is that, as many of you know, I will be teaching a course through the Astrology Hub, and this will be a 4-week course on chart interpretation. And the exciting thing about this is that each week for 4 weeks in the month of August, there'll be Thursday afternoons at 5 p.m. Western Time, 8 p.m. Eastern Time, and 2-hour class once a week on Thursday afternoons, where I will be doing 2 chart readings each week. And the chart readings will be done live with the person whose chart it is on video with me. So I will be interpreting the chart, asking questions, interacting with the client, but then also explaining to the group why I'm focusing on certain things. It'll be basically level 3 of the Foundations of Astrology series that I've done with Astrology Hub. Foundations 1 and 2 are still available. There's no requirement that you take those prior to this. It'll just be real-time chart analysis, and I'm looking forward to it. It's $97 for the entire series. If you can't, for the entire course. If you can't make 1 week, or if you can't make them live, you get them recorded. They'll be up within 24 hours, and you have those in your account forever, so you can watch those or rewatch those whenever you want. And one last thing, and that is Astrology Hub Inner Circle members and my Patreon subscribers get a 20% discount. And if you have any question as to what that discount code is, if you're a Patreon subscriber, send me an email or ask me on Patreon, and I will get back to you with that. That's first thing. The second thing I want to mention is an event coming up the end of September, and that's September 24th through the 26th. And this is an event that's being held live, real time, not virtual, at the Omega Institute, and that's in the Hudson River Valley, north of New York City, Rhinebeck, New York. That'll be September 24th through the 26th. And this is entitled Astrology, Consciousness, and the Great Shift. I will be one of 5 astrologers that will be teaching on schedule all weekend. Maurice Fernandez, Kay Taylor, Ann Ortley, and Catherine Andren will be joining me for this. And we'll be looking at, the what's going on. This is it's kind of like watching 5 different astrologers weave their individual threads into a cosmic tapestry, if you will. And we will actually be doing an opening panel all together and a closing panel all together. And it's going to be a fun weekend. And the link is down below. And I hope to see you there. Okay, that was it. Now let's get into the month. So every month has its own flavor, and as does August. But what's intriguing to me about August is that there are not a lot of, hardly any, aspects that are being made from outer planets to outer planets. The slower moving planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, are all either retrograde or just turning retrograde. And so their movement is a bit slower. There is action from the faster moving planets, and that would be the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, and Mars, that are acting on those outer planets. But here is the difference between August and many of the other months that we've recently gone through, and that is that the slower moving planets are more chronic in their presentation of events. And by chronic, I'm referring to Chronos, which is Greek for Saturn, which is Latin for Chronos, time. And when an issue or a sickness or an illness is considered to be chronic, it's something that has settled in over a long period of time. and it takes time to move through it, and often the cure itself takes time. At the other end of the spectrum, if we suffer from an acute situation, it typically comes and goes quickly. Now, what happens in August is that we have a month full of acute situations. However, those acute situations are often aspecting, that's the faster moving planets being the generators of the acute situations. They're aspecting the slower moving planets, which are stimulating these longer term issues. August to me feels like a rather noisy month. And although I'm tempted to say a noisy month when nothing happens, I don't think it's going to be quite that simple. It's just that there'll be a lot more activity of events and scenarios and crises and things than typical. And yet I don't see there being overwhelming and huge surprises. The level of newness or novelty, I think that we've experienced over the last year and a half or so, going back to the uh, uh, Saturn Pluto conjunction of January of 2020, and then the successive Jupiter Pluto conjunctions in 2020. These are all outer planet to outer planet transitions or transits. And then 2020 culminating with the Jupiter Saturn conjunction. Through 2021, we have an ongoing series of Saturn squaring Uranus. We will talk a little bit about that, although that aspect has widened at the beginning of August. There's over 4 degrees between the square between Saturn and Uranus. That means they're still working, but they're not as potent as they were at the beginning of the year, January and February, March, when they were much closer. And then again, for the second time in June, there will be a third time in late December. But right now, we're getting a little bit of a breather, but still, as the inner planets are making aspects to these outer planets, they're still stirring up the issues. And so I really think that that's a large part of what goes on this month. And as we open the month, let me switch to a chart view here so that we can see what's going on as I talk about it. Okay, so here we are looking at a chart for August 1st, 2021. These charts will be at 12 noon, and that's Pacific Daylight Time. They're Aries rising charts, so that no matter where you are on the globe, the planets will be correct for the time of day if you correct the time zone to your local time zone. So, for example, if you're in the Eastern United States, when it says 12 noon here, the chart will actually be for 3 p.m. where you are, and so on. So there's an important backdrop that is all through August. In fact, through the rest of the year, well, until December, anyhow. And that is that after a couple of months of moving ahead into Pisces, Jupiter has now retrograded back into Aquarius, where it will remain. Now, the fact of the matter is that Jupiter is not moving very fast right now, so it's not necessarily going to form a lot of aspects with other planets. But just the fact that Saturn is no longer alone in Aquarius, Jupiter has backed into Aquarius, and I think ameliorate some of the energy of Saturn being all by itself. Saturn, the planet of hardship and of tests and of the status quo, and Jupiter now backing into Aquarius where it will be all month. I think there's a feeling that Saturn's getting some help. There's some optimism that returns um, to the picture. But what's intriguing at the beginning of the month is that Mars has just moved into Virgo, and therefore we're coming off of a Mars Jupiter opposition, which is quite expansive. It's enthusiastic. It's engaged. It's even competitive. And as we move into August, on August 1st, that exhilaration and enthusiasm of the Mars opposition to Jupiter is replaced by Mercury making a conjunction, cazimi, lining up exactly with the sun. And this is a Mercury direct lining up with the sun, not Mercury retrograde. That means that Mercury is as far away from the Earth as it can get. It's on the far side of the sun. So that on the first day of August, if you draw a line from the Earth to the sun and keep going, you come up to Mercury. But if you then take that line and extend it the other way, from Mercury back through the sun, through the Earth, and go several hundred million miles, you'll come up to the planet Saturn. In other words, there's a line, a straight line between Saturn, the Earth, the Sun, and Mercury. And what this means is that the Mercury Sun conjunction is opposing Saturn. And this is an absolute extreme difference from the optimism that we've had for the few days prior. That on August 1st, it's almost like slamming into a wall, or seeing something ahead that's dangerous and slamming on our brakes. There's something here that, and yet it's less physical. Mars opposing Jupiter was physical because Mars is the planet of physicality. Here we're talking about intellectual, we're talking mental, we're talking people saying things and then having to step them back. We're talking about not being able to get away with making stuff up, with exaggerating. Mars opposing Jupiter was exaggerating, and now Mercury and the Sun opposing Saturn is like, we're not going to be able to get away with doing anything that's shady or outside of the law. Saturn being authority, Saturn being the law. But Saturn is also the status quo and the structure. And so this gives a bit of weight to the structure itself that sometimes can restrain, restrict, prohibit, change. And part of the issue all through 2021 is this dynamic conflict between Saturn, the planet of status quo and holding things as they are, the karmic planet, the you get what you deserve planet, the square between Saturn and Uranus, Uranus and Taurus. And Uranus is the breakthrough. It's the rebellious. It's the radical. It's the unconventional, and we're seeing this played out in dynamic conflict all around the globe, but certainly, especially in the United States, well, in England too, with the comings and goings of the fear that has been generated around the COVID pandemic, and the economic and political issues that that has stirred up, and how the economic and political issues are in fact re-stirring up the how we deal with this pandemic. I think that this is a large part of what's going on, but also we have just the political situation, the economic situation, again, not only in the United States, all around the world, where we have, like we do every time with Saturn and Uranus duking it out, we have a battle between the old and the new, between the conventional and non-conventional, between the conservative and the progressive, between the leave things as they are or return to the way they were, versus make things different, push into the future. That would be the Uranus side. So part of what happens this month is that since we start the month with with the Sun and Mercury opposing Saturn, what's going to happen then is that Mercury is moving a bit faster than, well, almost twice as fast as the Sun. So what's going to happen is that Mercury will square Uranus, and then the Sun will square Uranus. And actually, Mercury squares Uranus on the 3rd, and the Sun squares Uranus on the 6th. I'm going to move this forward just so you can watch here the transition from the Mercury Sun conjunction as it's opposing and being restrained and running into walls and dealing with reality and being held back until it's right by Saturn on August 1st. And then by August um, 3rd, we have that Mercury now squaring Uranus. It's still in range of the opposition. And there's also a trine to Chiron we'll come back to and talk about that in just a moment. But Mercury by the 3rd is trining Uranus. And by the 6th, we have this, I'm sorry, Mercury is squaring Uranus. And by the 6th, we have the Sun squaring Uranus. So we can see here that this situation between Mercury and the Sun, going back to the 1st, where we have Mercury and the Sun opposing Saturn, and then we have that Mercury and the Sun one by one squaring Uranus, and there's the Sun squaring Uranus. This is like a replay over several days, over nearly a week, of that same issue of holding back and expressing. And so you can play this out in whatever part of your life, relationship issues, job issues, family dynamics, or look at the more global political situations and see it how it's playing out there. But this is a very significant part of how the of how the month begins. Now, there's one other piece that is occurring in these first few days of August, and we'll go back to August 1st here. And that is, we notice that Mercury is also making a trine to Chiron on the 1st. And in fact, that trine is actually not until tomorrow on the 2nd. It's exact on the 2nd, when we also have Venus making a trine to Uranus. So this is a bit crazy because it's within a week of the energy holding back, and it's almost like by the 2nd, it's almost like there's a beginning of dialogue, because that Mercury Sun is actually first Mercury and then followed by the Sun is actually communicating with teacher, mentor, healer Chiron. And so we get that by the 2nd, and that even maintains through the 4th, that even maintains through the 4th, when we can see that the Sun then moves into that trine with Chiron also. And so there's some amelioration of that heavy energy of the Sun Mercury being opposed to Saturn. But the other thing that occurs in here is that Venus at the beginning of the month at 12 degrees of Virgo is coming into forming a trine with Uranus. And that trine is also exact on the 2nd. So let's kind of combine these things together, because what we have here is we have a mixture of holding back and then communication, working things out. That Venus trine Uranus is it's an appreciation, an attraction to those things which are different. It gives us the opportunity to allow ourselves to see things in ways that we didn't see them before and kind of like it. Now, this actually, I think, is a positive harbinger of what's to come, when that Mercury and then the Sun both in turn square Uranus by the 6th. And that energy there has, I think, some breakthrough to it. It's like we actually get to go somewhere. We get to move, and so in a way, this whole thing is a replay of the Saturn Uranus. And it's important to note here that Saturn has retrograded back, so it is earlier degrees than Uranus, meaning that the aspects that are hitting Saturn will hit Saturn first, and then will hit Uranus, just like we've seen here with the Sun Mercury conjunction hitting Saturn on the 1st, and then squaring Uranus on the 3rd and the 6th. And so the Saturn holds back, makes it real, get it better, do the work, and then the Uranus breaks through. Later on, as the Saturn gains speed after it turns direct, and by the end of the year, as it makes the 3rd and final square, by 2022, we will see Saturn at a higher degree than Uranus, which means that we will be able to have the structure Saturn as the final statement, rather than right now having Uranus as the final statement, which may leave things a little bit more disrupted or unsteady until we get to 2022. On August 8th, we have the first of the two lunations of the month. That lunation is a new moon on August 8th, and it occurs at 6:50 a.m. Pacific time. We are now looking at a chart for that 6:50 a.m. new moon in Leo. And there's a couple of things that are important about this new moon. Um, one of them is that it's not exactly making any aspects to anything. However, there's a couple of things it's doing that are close enough that I think are significant. And then there are a couple of things going on separate from the new moon that also color the energy. So, first of all, this new moon is just past the square to Uranus. Remember, we talked about how the Sun and Mercury opposed Saturn and then squared Uranus. Well, that Sun square Uranus was only a couple of days ago on the 6th. And now, as the moon sweeps through that same area of sky, the moon will actually oppose Saturn, making a little mini replay of that restraint, or it's not going to work, or holding back. And then the moon will reach the square to Uranus about 4 hours, 3, 4 hours prior to the new moon itself. So it'll be very early in the morning on August the 8th. But the new moon is still close enough that it is, in fact, opposing Saturn and squaring Uranus, replaying again that energy of the conflict that becomes the underpinning of the year. One thing that is of interest, though, is that with Jupiter back in Aquarius, again, it's not within range of being a conjunction to Saturn, but because they're in the same sign, Jupiter still, I think, is adding a bit of help. And we'll see in a little bit some of the aspects that are made to Jupiter that actually come along and I think make this easier. Even Mercury coming into oppose Jupiter over the next couple of days. That's exact by August 10th. And then the Sun will oppose Jupiter on the 19th. And so we have that same energy of those planets first meeting up with Saturn, then meeting up with Uranus. They're also then going to meet up with Jupiter. So that again is a bit of an ameliorating factor, or at least it lessens the negative or the difficult part of it, I think, a bit. The other thing about this new moon is that Venus is opposing Neptune. Now, that Venus opposition Neptune is exact on August 9th, but it's close enough on the 8th. It's within, I mean, this at noon. No, we're still here at early in the morning. I'm sorry, 6:50 a.m. Venus is almost at 21 degrees of Virgo. It's at 20 degrees 59 minutes. And so by later in the day, or within just a few minutes, actually, that Venus will reach 21 degrees of Virgo. And it basically it's within a couple of degrees of opposing Neptune. Venus Neptune is it's about the attractions and desires and the sweetness of Venus, but it's often residing in the imagination. I think Venus Neptune conjunctions are romantic, and I like to say that although it can be romantic in with relationship to love because it is Venus, it's also romantic in the sense of the age of romanticism, where there's more going on in the head than there is in the physical dimension. Um, Being a fan of poetry, I can think of the romantic poets, Byron, Keats in particular, but Shelley, um, that they could write stanza after stanza, page after page after page after page, like a romantic novel, and nothing happens. It's all internal dreams and imaginations and recollections and fears and progressions. And so this Venus opposing Neptune, I think, heightens that whole piece of where illusions fall into what's real, and this whole ongoing theme that we've been dealing with now for years, about reality or fake reality, or is it simulated reality, or is it being controlled, or what is real? And I think that when Venus opposes Neptune, that becomes exacerbated again. But we also have Mercury at this point in time moving from a quincunx to Neptune to a quincunx to Pluto. Now, Neptune and Pluto are nearly sextile. They're about 3 degrees off, I mean, a little bit less than that. Hold on, a little bit. Yeah, a little bit less than that, closer to 2 degrees plus. And so we look at that Mercury. Mercury actually quincunxes Neptune on the 7th, just prior to the new moon. You can see here Mercury is at 23 degrees already, and the Neptune is at 22. But that Mercury then will quincunx Pluto the following day on the 9th. And remember, Mercury is how we think. And and in Leo, we think out loud. We think through action. We basically, instead of spending time in contemplation like we did with Mercury in Cancer, or we will with Mercury in Virgo. Actually, it'll be less contemplation than more analysis when Mercury moves into Virgo in just a few days on August 11th, actually. So but what happens here is this whole, because Mercury is in the same sign as the new moon, there's this sense that the show that we want to put on, that in some ways had to deal with the oppression or the resistance of Saturn, and is now then the unpredictable craziness of Uranus. Meanwhile, the what we say is not what people are hearing. What people are saying is not what we are hearing, because the Mercury quincunx to Neptune is basically distorting the language, the intellectual sending and receiving of information, and how we put that together in our minds. And yet, that Mercury then is also moving toward that quincunx to Pluto, which deepens it. It kind of brings in this whole issue of control and power, and somehow it might feel like we're either being fed a line, or that we're being misled. Not that that is a unique feeling these days. Um, but what happens is that, as I mentioned before, by the 10th, we have the Mercury now coming into opposition to Jupiter. There's Mercury opposing Jupiter. And now we're just past the Venus opposing Neptune, which was exact on the 9th. But we also have now um, Venus by the 11th. We have Venus making a square and a half to Saturn. That's buried here. That's that orange line. There, I'll highlight it so you can see it better. And this again is an aspect like a square. There's some difficulty, there's some annoyance, there's some even anxiety over what we like, what we want. Remember, Venus in Virgo is a bit timid. I would say cautious, but that's more Venus in Cancer. In Virgo, Venus just wants to make sure it's doing the right thing. It has all the check boxes, it has the lists, it's doing the analysis before it shows its vulnerability. And here, because Saturn seems to be on its case, raining on its parade, especially because the moon is moving through Virgo, also on the 11th and right there, that this may feel like a bit of a Saturnian weight, like our parents are watching us, or like our boss is requiring us to do something, or something of that sort. But what's intriguing about this is that we also, on the 11th, also have Venus forming a trine with Pluto. And so on one hand, Venus is getting a little bit of grief from the structure, from the obvious, from the boss, but somehow the system, that's Pluto. Pluto's more powerful than just the singular boss, unless the boss happens to be, like the super boss, the mafioso boss, the person who's really in control. But with Venus trining Pluto, there's a sense of getting some much deeper support, even though we may be struggling with something on the surface. And also on the 11th, quite a busy day. We can see here, let's move this back to being at noon. We can see that at noon on August 11th, Mercury is at 29 degrees and 46 minutes of Leo. In fact, by 3 in the afternoon, Mercury has actually moved into Virgo, and Mercury in Virgo is at home. Mercury's relieved to be back in Virgo, because Mercury rules two signs. Mercury rules both Gemini and Virgo. And Mercury stays in Virgo all the way through August 29th, when it will move into Libra. We'll mention that at the end, but we'll speak more of that in September, because September will begin with Mercury already in Libra. But right now we have, on the 11th, Mercury entering Virgo, where it'll be pretty much for the rest of the month, until August 29th. And again, Mercury at home in Virgo is wants to get things right. It wants to do the research, but it's not the deep digging research that Mercury would do in Scorpio. It's the analysis of available data. Mercury in Virgo listens carefully, speaks carefully, wants the clarity, and is very significantly wants to actually get specific, and will risk making a point by not saying anything if it thinks it might be inaccurate. There's a thing, I mean, in Leo, Mercury was willing to tell a story, maybe even more so when Mercury is in Gemini. But we can see that by the 10th, we're beginning to get this pile up of planets. The moon by the 10th actually moves out of Virgo into Libra. But we have Mercury, Mars, and Venus all in Virgo. Venus actually remains in Virgo until the 15th, when she moves into Libra, or when they move into Libra. We have to be careful with gender issues, because um, just because we do. I mean, Venus is certainly considered to be feminine energy, but we have to remember that Venus is also a very powerful deity that in many cultures is considered to be a warrior. Venus has a warrior side, just like Mars has the side of a lover. In modern astrology, we've kind of demoted Mars away from that by giving Scorpio to Pluto. And because it used to be that Mars ruled both Aries and Scorpio. And I would suggest that it's important for us to remember that Mars also can be emotional, wet, astrologically watery in Scorpio. And by the same token, Venus, isn't always just sweet and pretty. In fact, there's a wonderful book by Thomas More, the guy who wrote all the soul books, that's about Eris and the darker side of Eris, that you don't just get all the sweet stuff. When you move into that realm, you really need to have it all. It's a whole spectrum. Anyhow, on the Um, 13th, we have Mars now making a quincunx with Saturn, like Venus did prior with Pluto. That quincunx is annoying. We have a series of quincunxes over the next several days. We have Mars making a quincunx with Saturn. We have Venus making a quincunx with Jupiter. You can see that that's already close. That's exact on the 14th. I'll actually move this ahead as I talk. There's the Venus quincunx to Jupiter. We have the Sun making a quincunx to Neptune, and then we have Mercury making a quincunx to Saturn, and that'll be by the 16th that Mercury quincunx to Saturn, and then the Sun makes a quincunx to Pluto, and that's on the 17th, and then Mars and Mercury as they're moving toward conjunction they both make a quincunx. Let's even move this ahead. We can see Mercury moving toward Mars. Mercury and Mars conjoin on the 18th, and they both make a quincunx with Chiron. Now, last month in July, there were quincunxes all month. Part of the irritating factor of July was the frustration of not being able to resolve things, that there were just annoyances that kept popping up. In August, we have pretty much the quincunxes stuffed between the 13th, well, maybe a touch on the 9th, but between the 13th and the 18th. So there's like a short week, a 5-day period where we're getting quincunx after quincunx after quincunx. Say that 5 times fast. Well, I just said it 3 times, so I'm almost there. Um, this is about not being able to get it right. In the same period of time, we have Venus that actually moves into Libra, I'd mentioned earlier, on the 15th, which does sweeten the energy some because Venus is at home in Libra. In Libra, Venus likes things the way she can imagine them or put them in her mind. Venus in Libra, unlike in Taurus, her other home sign, in Taurus, Venus is practical, grounded, earthy, gardening, hands on, sensual, physical. In Libra, Venus is more about artistic design. It's landscape architecture. It's making things. It's even the architect. It's the diplomat. It's the person who's going between the counselor, the psychologist, the host or hostess. Venus in Libra wants to make things in balance, and so this does temper or moderate all the quincunx energy that is coming to the surface this week, but I don't think it'll make it completely go away. The one outer planet aspect that does happen all through this month is that on the 17th, Jupiter makes a half square with Chiron. Now, Jupiter and Chiron together are interesting because I often think of Jupiter Chiron together as the person who always believes that the next experience is going to be the one that fixes everything, solves everything in the world. The next meditation is going to be the one that'll bring them to nirvana. The next medical cure is the one that'll fix what ails them. There's a sense of Venus and Chiron as being the rainbow chaser, always having the next rainbow with a pot of gold that turns out to be not there, or the end of the rainbow turns out to be not there. But with Jupiter forming a half square to Chiron, I think that for a few days around this period of time, that this is just going to intensify all that quincunx energy, because I think we realize that the cure isn't working, or that what we had hoped for to happen, we may be falling short. And this is not a long-term forever thing, but it's something that if we do run into something during this time, it's important not to be discouraged, to put it into a larger perspective and know that Jupiter will move on. Now, by the 18th, let's move back to the 18th where we were just a moment ago. We can see here that on the 18th, Mercury catching up to Mars. Midday, we can see that Mercury at 12 degrees Virgo, 12 minutes. um, less than about a quarter of a degree from Mars at 12 degrees Virgo, 35 minutes. If we move this ahead one day, boom, there's Mercury now on the other side of Mars. And so Mercury lining up with Mars often is angry words. Why? Mars is feisty, it's fiery. Um, Mercury is how we talk. Often, when Mars and Mercury get together, there can be arguments. There can be, we can come on too forcefully. But here, Mercury is in its home sign. And Mercury, I think, is going to cool that Mars energy a little bit. Mars is already cooled a bit in Virgo. Mars can't drive the car the way it did when it was in Leo, driving its Maserati for show. Now in Virgo, it's probably driving, a Volvo, or something that is much sturdier and lower key. Maybe a Volvo wasn't a good choice there, but there's something here that's more effective and efficient. And it doesn't want to waste energy on just getting angry if it's not going to work. Now, the other thing, though, that comes into play is that both Mars and Mercury, which are um, which pack a bit of a punch when they're together, are first that quincunx to Chiron that occurred yesterday. And so there's again this healing that may not be happening. There's someone having the truth and teaching it and people not hearing it. There's something here that we're missing. We can't quite get it right. But by the time that we move to the 19th, the sun is now opposing Jupiter. um, Uranus makes its station. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And also, Mercury and Mars are both coming in to a trine with Uranus. Now, let's talk about that Uranus for just a moment, because Uranus is at the middle of its run through Taurus. Taurus, every sign has 30 degrees. So here we have Uranus having reached nearly 15 degrees, 14 degrees, 48 minutes. That's 14 and three quarters of a degree. And Uranus slows down. I mean, it is already, before it turns retrograde, going back a week, it was at 1447, and now it's at 1448. And in fact, that, even if we project forward, it stays at that 1447, 14 degrees 47 minutes for days. So when a planet is stationary, it holds more power. Remember, the slower moving the planet, a rough rule of thumb, it's not always the case, but usually as a planet moves slower, it gains more power. The planets that move slower always have more chronic power, Pluto being the slowest moving, and the Mercury and the Moon being the fastest. And they're the ones that by the time something happens, well, they're gone and something else is happening already. But with Uranus holding its position for over a week, for several weeks, we can just quickly here do this a week at a time and go back to the beginning of the month. And we have, actually, on August 5th, Uranus is at 14 degrees 43 minutes. And when it turns retrograde, it's only moved 1/20th of a degree, 5 minutes of orb, to 14 degrees 48 minutes. And by the beginning of September, it's still only moved that 5 minutes, 1/20th of a degree. Is that right? 5 minutes, 1/12. I'm sorry, 1/12 of a degree backwards. Still not very much at all. So through the entire month of August, Uranus really only moves 1/12th of a degree one way and then the other. And that's pretty extraordinary. So Uranus has power. This is the time when Uranus, in some ways, is holding its position even more than other planets, because they're all in motion, even though they're in motion slowly and or retrograde. And when Uranus turns retrograde, it basically is the marker that things are not moving ahead as fast as we would like them to. Now, the high frequency, acute, personal planets, Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, they're all moving direct. But when we get to Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Chiron, they're all either moving retrograde or, in Uranus's case, not moving at all, barely for the entire month. And so, and then of course, it's then going to pick up a little bit of speed in its retrograde motion. But it's like we're running ahead of ourselves, but reality is still back here, and it takes a while until these planets begin to turn direct later in the fall and early winter, when things begin to move forward again. So that takes us up to the 19th. Oh, and we also have on the 19th the sun forming a square and a half. We talked about the half square from Jupiter to Chiron. Now we have a square and a half from the sun to Chiron, and the sun opposing Jupiter. This is about overindulgence, overconfidence, overdoing. Things look good. I mean, and of course, although they look good, that Chiron in that semi-square and square and a half to both ends of that opposition is kind of like it's not letting go. And I imagine this could be COVID related, but there may be other pieces to this also. Um, One of the saving graces, though, is that Mercury and Venus, as I mentioned before, is moving into a trine. They are moving into trines with Uranus. Mercury moving a bit faster than Mars, and by the 20th, well, we're still a week at a time. Let's move that back to a day at a time. Animate that way. Um, that um, that Mercury on the 20th is exact trine to Uranus, and on the 21st, it's Mars. This again is change happens easier. The things that we've been struggling to uh, to change for weeks, months, years, now all of a sudden just happen. Now, what's that saying? It's as easy as falling off a rolling log. You know, that log rolling thing where you have it was a competition, apparently back in the day, lumberjacks would take one of these large trees and float it, and they would stand on it, and who could, dance rolling it backward and forward, was the champion. Well, it's a tough thing to do, and it's almost like Mercury and Mars trining Uranus is as easy as falling off a rolling log. It's like change occurs without much effort. Now, that can be a little frightening if you're holding on to something that you don't want to change. On the other hand, there are those things that we've been trying to make changes with or upon, and this is a great time to actually nudge those, because we have a bit of a movement here that comes not only from the the Mercury and Mars trining Uranus, but a couple of days later we'll get that reinforced as Venus moves into its trine, and Venus moves into a trine with Saturn on the 23rd. However, in the interim, we have an important event, and that's the second lunation of the month, and that is the moon having now moved into Aquarius. The moon is moving toward its opposition. By midday on the 22nd, you can see here the moon has already moved into Pisces. The actual full moon itself in Aquarius occurs at 5:01 a.m. Here we have the chart for the full moon at 29 degrees of Aquarius and 37 minutes. Obviously, that is a sun moon opposition. The interesting thing about this full moon, well, there's a few things interesting about it. First of all, it's the second full moon in Aquarius, and yet during this full moon in Aquarius, Jupiter is not only in the picture; it's close enough to be conjoined that full moon on the night of the full moon, or even the night before and or after. Once the sun has gone down, we'll be able to see Venus as an evening star in the western sky. But once the sun has gone down enough below the horizon, that will mean that the moon will be rising opposite the sun, obviously in the east, and we'll be able to see, looking at the moon, depending upon whether we're the day before, day of, or day after, we'll be able to see the moon, Jupiter, and Saturn all together in the sky And in fact, on the night of the full moon or early that morning, we'll be able to see that Jupiter moon alignment pretty darn close. And the actual full moon itself, as I said earlier, occurs at 5:01 a.m. Western time, 8:01 a.m. Eastern U.S. time. And this full moon, because it's conjunct Jupiter, has that sense of hope and optimism. We still have Jupiter and Chiron in that semi square that has not gone away because they're moving slowly enough. But the fact of the matter is that Jupiter now stands out. There's two other things that are important here at the full moon itself, and one is we're still getting that Mars trine to Uranus. The Mars trine Uranus is slightly past. It was like 6 hours prior to the full moon itself. But this is about the excitement of innovation. This is about taking action. This is about doing something finally that breaks free from the Saturnian claws that have been holding back. And yet, we're also getting a Venus trine Saturn that I mentioned earlier. That's not exact, that Venus trine Saturn is not exact until about 24 hours after the full moon. But what this is suggesting is that whatever actions we take, even though we may overextend, it may be too much. If we're doing it for Aquarius, for the good of all, that it could work out, because then Venus trining Saturn basically comes in with support and says, if this is good for everyone, it will be good. It will be good, and it could happen. So I think that this is a propitious full moon. I think that of the two lunations, that this is the one that has more of a punch, and I think that we should, or we could, in fact, really consider what is it that we're going to do at this full moon to make use of the ability to make change that theoretically, because of the Venus trining Saturn, will still have some lasting value and lasting impact. So as we move on, the next thing we encounter is on August 24th, we have Mercury opposing opposing Neptune in Pisces. And interestingly enough, the moon is back in the picture, so that we have Mercury opposing Pisces. So we have Mercury, it's too many planets and signs here. We have Mercury opposing Neptune in Pisces first, but that will be followed by Mars opposing Neptune in Pisces the beginning of September. And what this is doing is this is exacerbating that whole piece of fake news, real news. It's implying that there again is something going on where people aren't either speaking honestly or they're misunderstanding. And yet there's always a higher potential with Neptune, and that has to do with the aspect of the creative, the dream, the imagination that's used to motivate, to inspire. And I think that both of these are possible here. Again, especially because Mercury is in Virgo, I don't think we're quite as ready to just let go of reality and float off into Neptune land, because Mercury is holding that energy and wanting to make things real, because Virgo is an earth sign, and it's followed up by Mars moving in closer and closer. And again, I think that this is a very dreamy moment in time. Um, but what happens then is that Venus, as you can see, is also moving towards its opposition to Chiron. That occurs on the 26th. And and again, I think Venus Chiron is a potential for healing. There's this sense, interestingly enough, now we have, prior we had the Sun opposed Jupiter with Chiron at that point that was half square and square and a half to the planets in the opposition. Now we have Venus and Chiron in opposition with Jupiter at that exacerbation point. And so here the warning is not to take things too much, not to go too far. And that's easy to do. And it's especially easy to do if we have the power of knowing that we are right. This is that moral certainty, that moral righteousness, because Mercury is now forming a trine with Pluto, which is giving us that ability to draw from a very deep well of power. And again, I think that moral righteousness becomes a strong piece of this if we let it get away from us. We end the month with Mercury moving from Virgo out of its home sign and into. Let's just back up one more thing here, because we also have Venus making a quincunx on the 27th and 28th. We have first Mercury making a quincunx with Jupiter. And again, this is how much do I say? How much don't I say? What's enough? What's too much when it comes to delivering my message? And then on the 28th, we have Venus making that quincunx to Uranus, again with the moon in the picture with Uranus this time. And this is also a bit of annoyance because we're uncertain of how vulnerable to be, how much we should actually extend ourselves in being nice and presenting a way of solving an issue that may have been annoying and may still be annoying to us. On the 29th, we have Mercury making a square and a half with Uranus. And again, this is about language getting in the way of the breakthrough. This is about words that are being spoken maybe impulsively or with great certainty. Certainty isn't the word I'm looking for. Great accuracy, Mercury in Virgo. And yet it's stirring up more than we want to stir up. And on that same day, on the 29th, not until later in the day, I'll run this ahead to the 30th. You can see now that Mercury has moved out of Virgo into Libra. And although Mercury is no longer in its home sign, because it's now in the sign with Venus, I think that there is a softening here. I think there's a willingness to compromise. Um, um, the Sun does make a quincunx with Saturn, and so there is an obstacle that we've bumped up against. But I think that there is potential here for hope. There's a potential for making something work, even though we may not get what we want. Or let me put it a different way: when a compromise is reached, something's got to give, and everyone doesn't get what everyone wants. So that takes us to the end of the month. And in summary, there's a lot going on, but I kind of feel like this is a month of never-ending noise. The noise factor is high, and just to repeat what I said at the beginning, it's not that we don't get anywhere. It's just that we don't get anywhere hugely significant fast enough with all the things that we wanted to do once we were there. There's something that still needs to follow through. But I think that August can be seminal in the larger picture as these outer planets begin moving direct. And as we get the third and final Saturn square Uranus toward the end of December, I think that we'll kind of see this, how this year will play out. But right now, obviously, things are still in motion, and I think we just need to take it one step at a time. There is a saying that comes from some Swami who I can't recall who actually said it, but it goes like this: inch by inch, it's a cinch. Yard by yard, it's hard. That's it. I hope to see many of you at the Astrology Hub chart reading extravaganza. Remember, there's a 20% discount for you Patreon subscribers and Astrology Hub Inner Circle members. That link again is astrologyhub.com/charts. And I'll see some of you at Omega at the end of September. I'll say more about that in next month's. That's it for now. As always, think cosmically, but act locally. I'm Rick Levine.